Alright guys, welcome back to Underground Science, and in this video, we'll be talking about the Haldane effect. Alright, so before I start, I just want to say make sure to go and watch my Bohr effect video, and also I think it's pretty important to watch the intracellular erythrocyte reaction videos. I think I had 3 for that, because it's just going to be that, and especially the Bohr effect video, it's just the opposite of the Bohr effect, alright? So make sure to know the main reactions that happen inside an erythrocyte or a red blood cell, like near a muscle tissue where we see the Bohr effect take place, right? We've been using the muscle cell example. And then now we're going to see what happens when those red blood cells that have a lot of partial pressure of CO2, right? And have a high saturation of CO2 bounded to hemoglobin. We're going to see in the Haldane effect how oxygen will now compete with the CO2 and the H plus cations, right? That's bound to the hemoglobin, how oxygen will compete there near the lungs because of such high concentration of oxygen and high partial pressure of oxygen near the lungs. All right, so let's go and get started. So here we see a graph, right, of the Haldane effect. So this black line right here represents what happens regularly. All right, so if we look at the black line here, we can just choose a point. If we choose this point, let's say that this point is our muscle cell. All right, just a muscle tissue cell, any muscle, any skeletal muscle cell even we can say. All right, so let's just go and say any muscle cell here. All right, so just say muscle tissue. All right, so just parentheses tissue. And regularly, right, when we're not exercising, this would be the regular line of what's happening, right, in terms of partial pressure of CO2 and CO2 saturation of the hemoglobin. But what happens when we start exercising, we start producing more CO2, and we see CO2 competing with oxyhemoglobin, right? The red blood cells near the muscle cell, which we looked at, that took place in the Bohr effect. But now we're going to see what happens in relation to CO2 on the x-axis and CO2 saturation on the hemoglobin when we increase oxygen levels near the lungs. That's going to be the Haldane effect, which is right here, this blue line. All right, so the reason why I put a muscle cell, muscle tissue here is because usually muscle tissue, since we're exercising or any situation, right, the muscle tissue will have, or the blood near the muscle tissue especially, will have a high partial pressure of CO2, right? It's going to have the highest partial pressure of CO2 here near the muscle tissue because we're producing a lot of CO2. And we see that we have the lowest partial pressure of CO2 right near the lungs, because the lungs is the highest partial pressure of oxygen, right? Because it's right near the lungs, and the lungs have plenty of oxygen in there, right, in the alveoli. So this dot we're gonna represent as the lungs. All right, and so the main thing we'll see at the end of this video is the CO2 delivery from the tissue to the lungs. All right, and how the Haldane effect affects the CO2 delivery from the tissue to the lungs. All right, but first let's just go and quickly analyze the Haldane effect. So let me go and write the reactions that happen. The main reaction involving CO2, I'll leave out the hydrogen cation reaction. This time I'll just write the CO2 reaction, what happens when we get to the muscle cell when we saw the Bohr effect. So this will be in relation to the Bohr effect. All right, so remember in the Bohr effect, actually, you know what, let's just write it below the graph because it kind of seems like the graph represents the Bohr effect, but it doesn't. So when we saw the Bohr effect video, we saw that when when the lungs, right, delivered oxygen to our red blood cells, right, and near pulmonary capillaries, and then it turned into venules, went to the heart and got pumped into circulation, right? When that oxygenated red blood cell with its oxyhemoglobin came near the exercising muscle tissue, we saw that the muscle tissue was producing a lot of CO2, and remember, this is what we saw. So oxygen was bounded to hemoglobin, right, oxyhemoglobin, but then we saw, so this is just going to be the CO2 reaction, is that carbon dioxide competed, right? It started competing with the oxyhemoglobin, right, in the red blood cell. And then what we saw was that it won the competition. And we saw that now carbon dioxide was bound to the hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. And then we saw a hydrogen cation in the product, and we saw the oxygen, that got kicked out, right? That is now free to go to the muscle tissue. So let's go and write that out. Then we saw that the oxygen that got kicked off because of the CO2 competition went to the muscle tissue that desperately needed that oxygen so it can continue its ATP production, right, in the electron transport chain. So this is the muscle cell, right? So we'll go to the muscle cell, and again, we'll just leave out the hydrogen cation reaction, right, that also competed, because we're just trying to focus on CO2 right now. So this is what we saw happening near the muscle cell. Now we saw that there was a lot of CO2 coming back to the lungs in the form of carbaminohemoglobin, and in the main form where carbon dioxide comes back to the lungs is in the form of bicarb. All right, so you know what, let's just go and write the H plus reaction also. So the so this hydrogen cation, right, that was produced via the competition of CO2 to oxyhemoglobin is also going to compete with other hemoglobin structures inside the red blood cell, because we're trying to, remember, near the muscle cell, we're trying to kick off as much oxygen as we can so the oxygen can go to the muscle cell. So the H plus is then going to come here, and it's going to be like, yo, right, I want the hemoglobin. So that it's going to compete with the oxyhemoglobin, right? Oxyhemoglobin is just oxygen bound to hemoglobin, and it's going to win the competition. Now, H plus is going to be bound to hemoglobin. Remember, this is all happening near the muscle cell in the red blood cell, all right, as the Bohr effect. So the Bohr effect is mainly this part, where we see that as we increase the increase the concentration of CO2 and H plus, we see that the oxygen saturation that was previously high is pretty much drops, all right, as the partial pressure of oxygen decreases. So let me go ahead and write down the H plus. So the H plus wins and we kick off oxygen. Again, this oxygen molecule, this diatomic oxygen, will go to the muscle cell. All right, so the muscle cell can use that in cellular respiration. Okay, so now what happens, one other thing that happens inside the red blood cell is that it's actually kind of part of the Haldane effect also, is that there's water inside the blood cell, all right? So remember, everything I'm writing right now is inside the blood cell. So there's water inside the blood cell and it combines with CO2, right? That's coming from the muscle cell, and it actually makes carbonic acid. So carbonic acid is just like this, and it's already balanced, right? And it can't make this by itself, it needs a catalyst. And this catalyst is carbonic anhydrase. All right, so carbonic anhydrase helps catalyze the reaction between H2O, combine it with CO2 and make carbonic acid inside the red blood cell. And then what happens is that carbonic acid dissociates into bicarb and an H plus cation. And again, this H plus cation will then go and follow this reaction, compete with more oxyhemoglobin, resulting in kicking off more oxygen and going to the muscle cell, right? That's what we said in the Bohr effect. But look at this, right? So bicarb is kind of like indirectly carrying most of the CO2, right? Because we'll see right now in the Haldane effect how bicarb will then turn back into carbonic acid, and then again dissociate into H2O and CO2 via carbonic anhydrase near the lungs. All right, so one other thing we said is that once this reaction happens, most of the bicarb generally goes into the plasma and will come back into the red blood cell near the lungs. All right, so let's go and see what happens in the Haldane effect. So the Haldane effect is the opposite. And remember, the Bohr effect, we had partial pressure of oxygen and oxygen saturation on hemoglobin. Now it's the opposite. So again, the highest partial pressure is near the muscle, and the lowest partial pressure of CO2 is near the lungs. All right, so what happens is that regularly, right, as partial pressure of CO2 decreases, right, we have less competition for hemoglobin, so the saturation of carbon dioxide bound to hemoglobin decreases, right? But in the Haldane effect, if you look at the same exact point, right, near the lungs, especially near the lungs, what's happening here is that for the Haldane effect, we look at what happens when we increase the concentration of oxygen. So if we increase the concentration of oxygen near the lungs, we see that CO2 saturation drops, right? Less CO2 is now going to be bound onto hemoglobin. Why does that happen? Because remember, we'll make a video on this later, is the Le Chatelier's principle, right? So if we increase the concentration of oxygen near the lungs, we're increasing the concentration of oxygen in the product side. And Le Chatelier's principle says we have to balance the reaction. We always have to have a balanced reaction in terms of equilibrium, right? So if we increase the concentration of oxygen, we have to shift the whole reaction to the left so that we can make more reactant since we're increasing the product side, especially the oxygen. All right, so if we increase the concentration of oxygen, we'll have to shift the reaction to the left. So now all these reactions that have oxygen in the product side is going to be shifted backwards. So the backwards reaction is going to take place now. And if you see, when the backward reaction takes place, now it's oxygen competing with carbaminohemoglobin. So now oxygen competes with carbaminohemoglobin, kicking off the CO2 near the lungs, which is what we need. That's what we breathe out, the waste product CO2. And then we see we have oxyhemoglobin again, right? Once oxygen competes. All right, so now oxygen is winning the war. So let's see what happens. Let's see the reactions that occur during the Haldane effect. All right, so the Haldane effect, again, is pretty much the opposite of the Bohr effect. It's literally the opposite because we just said the reaction is just the opposite near the lungs. All right, so let's go and see what happens. So in the Haldane effect, let's take this reaction first. Remember, we're increasing the concentration of O2 because we're near the muscle cell. Le Chatelier's principle says that we have to balance whatever side's getting affected. So if we're increasing the oxygen concentration on the product side, right, we have to shift the reaction on the opposite side wherever we're increasing so we can balance the oxygen concentration out. All right, so if we shift this reaction to the left, now the reaction is going to be driven this way. So now so you could see how it's the opposite of the Bohr effect. So pretty much we just have to write the opposite reaction. So O2 will now compete with the carbaminohemoglobin, the carbon dioxide bound to the hemoglobin, and that's going to result in oxygen winning. Now oxygen, C, is bounded to hemoglobin as oxyhemoglobin, and CO2 is now the one that got kicked off. Now the CO2 will go to the lungs, right, because of diffusion, because there's high partial pressure of CO2 and low partial pressure of CO2 in the lungs, and high partial pressure of CO2 near the pulmonary capillaries of the lungs. So now this will go to the lungs. So see how oxygen just competed and won the war here, right? And now let's go and look at this reaction, how it competes with the H plus cations, right? So now we just write that reaction backwards again. Oxygen, since there's such a high concentration of oxygen near the lungs, right? Oxygen concentration will increase, sorry, I couldn't say that properly, and then the reaction will shift this way because of Le Chatelier's principle, all right? So what we're going to see is that just the backwards reaction again. So oxygen is going to compete with, oxygen is going to compete with hemoglobin, or it compete with the H plus that's bounded to the hemoglobin, right? And that's going to lead to oxygen winning. See, we kicked off the H plus, right? It's not part of the party anymore, and oxyhemoglobin is back to normal, right? Like it's supposed to be near the lungs, and the cycle repeats itself, and the H plus, so this is the part where we see where we see the bicarb come into play, right? Remember we said the bicarb was the main way of carrying CO2? Well, what we see here is that as we kick off the H plus cations, since there's more free H plus cations, we see that the bicarb that was initially in the plasma enters the red blood cell. So now we're going to see, because we have more free hydrogen cations, the bicarb is going to be like, all right, bet, I'll come into the red blood cell. All right, so the bicarb enters the red blood cell. And remember, all of this that we're initially writing, all these reactions are taking place in the red blood cell. So now we have the bicarb here, right, in the red blood cell. And perfect, we have H plus here also. So bicarb and H plus will join together and make carbonic acid, right? So let's go and write that down. So bicarb and H plus will join together and make carbonic acid. Now carbonic acid will then dissociate, right? You can think of it as dissociating with the help of carbonic anhydrase into CO2 and water. See, so it kind of indirectly was carrying that CO2 as bicarb, right? That's why bicarb is the main way that our bodies, our blood, it's the main way that CO2 is carried in our blood, I should say, all right? And remember, we need the help of carbonic anhydrase. All right, so we need the help of carbonic anhydrase, and then this CO2 will then go to the lungs, right? Because it just got kicked off, we'll go to the lungs, and this is just water, all right? So that's which is part of our plasma also. So that's pretty much the main things that happen in the Haldane effect. So as you can see here, let's go back to the graph now that we know the reactions. Near the lungs, we saw oxygen shifted the reaction to the left, right, as the Haldane effect because of Le Chatelier's principle, which led to more oxygen competing with the CO2 that was already bound to the hemoglobin as carbaminohemoglobin. And because there was so much oxygen competing with carbaminohemoglobin, we saw CO2 leave the hemoglobin, right? It got kicked off because of oxygen competition. And that's why we saw a decrease in the saturation level of CO2 bounded to hemoglobin near the lungs, right? Because remember, the lungs, we said that in the Haldane effect, if we take in the example of increasing oxygen concentration near the lungs, the more oxygen we'll have, the more competition, which means the more decrease in CO2 saturation of the hemoglobin. All right, so initially we had this amount, right, this much CO2 being delivered. So from here to here, initially, right, without the Haldane effect, without taking into consideration of the Haldane effect, this is the amount of CO2 delivered to the lungs. From the tissue, right, now, because if we take into consideration of the Haldane effect, if we increase the concentration of oxygen near the lungs, we see that we have even the saturation of CO2 to hemoglobin is even less, right? It has much of a less value compared to here. So we'll see that with the Haldane effect, you deliver much more CO2 to the lungs from the tissue, right? Because watch this, instead of only delivering this much, right? Because of the Haldane effect, we're going to be delivering this much all the way here. So the difference is this whole area right here, right? So that's a lot more CO2 delivered to the lungs because of the Haldane effect. And we saw that it's because of increasing the concentration of oxygen right near the lungs, we'll see more competition of the carbaminohemoglobin, leading to carbon dioxide being kicked off, which means less saturation of carbon dioxide hemoglobin, which means we just looked at the Haldane effect, right? More oxyhemoglobin. And the cycle is going to repeat itself. All right, so that's the basic idea of the Haldane effect. I really hope this video made sense to you guys. I hope it wasn't too boring or confusing, right? I hope to see you guys in my future videos. We'll talk about more cool topics about biochem, physics, and chem. Don't forget to hit that notification bell, like, and subscribe. And see you guys later, and stay safe.